variety of things so far regarding Ezra. All right. We are in Ezra chapter 5, to be specific. And if you were here Sunday, we had some discussions around kind of the background. I think it's really important, and we've talked about this, both Mr. Jack and I, and then Roger Sanders will be teaching with us as well. We've talked a lot about the importance of understanding the background of what's going on around the people at this time. I think it really gives more impact to maybe the decisions that are made, the comments that Ezra makes in his writings. On Sunday, I referenced the fact that there's a section of scriptures in chapter 4 that are not chronological. And this, I want to reiterate, is one view. Some people believe the names that are mentioned in chapter 4 in that section of scripture are simply names that maybe are all the same and they were more of titles. So I just wanted to underscore that while I gave you a one perspective as a student to understand that section of scripture in chapter 4 is, maybe a future tense time period, and the writer's just writing about it from a historical perspective. There are other viewpoints, but the key that we studied about on chapter 4 is that there was resistance that the people were having to deal with. And tonight in chapter 5, as we begin looking at it, we see where, just as we ended chapter 4, where Darius is aware of the people and the making them stop as a result. He is the king of Persia. And so that's where we are. With Darius as the king of Persia, we begin now in chapter 5, where it begins talking about they're starting to build again. So they've stopped. And it's been about 16 years now since they've stopped building the temple as a result of leadership. So it's a real short section tonight. We're going to read through it. And then I've got some thoughts and would love to get some feedback from you as well, because I think there's a lot of life lessons that we can apply to our own lives as it relates to what the children of Israel were dealing with at that time. And it's really a good chapter. So we'll go through the first section here. It says, "Now the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the sons of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jezodak, arose and began to rebuild the house of God that is in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were with them, supporting them at the same time, Tattenai, the governor of the province of beyond the river, and Shethar-Bezoni and their associates came to them and spoke to them thus, 'Who gave you this decree to build this house and to finish this structure?' They also asked them this, 'What are the names of the men who are building this building?' But the eye of God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop until the report should reach Darius, and then answer be returned by letter concerning it." Haggai and Zechariah. Who are these individuals? Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. What? They're minor prophets. That's the ones we talk as minor prophets. I think many times we forget these are individuals that are a part of the story too. And in this particular case, you've got Haggai that I believe is the one that is known to be very practical talker, but he's very concise with his messaging, whereas you've got Zechariah, who may be a little bit more, prophesying in different ways. It's not as plainly spoken. But you've got two individuals here that are men of God that are encouraging the people to start again. And I think there's some key things in here that sometimes you can read over them if you're not really looking at it. It says there at the end of verse 1 that in Judah and Jerusalem, in the name of God. Haggai and Zechariah were speaking on behalf of God. They were acting and encouraging the men by the name of God, of Israel. And I think if you think about something that's been halted for over a decade, if somebody has driven by a project, we drive to Nashville and you see I think there's 50,000 cranes now in Nashville. We never saw a crane in Nashville growing up here, and now we see them everywhere. Well, if you saw something that was been started and then now it's been stopped for over a decade, probably aren't very hopeful that that's ever going to get back up off the ground. And so what I'm trying to get across here is that there's always emotions and feelings that go into a people now who are trying to reinvigorate their identity. And that's what the children of Israel are doing. And here's Haggai and Zechariah, who are, I think, clearly being motivated by the Lord to get them going. And that's exactly what we read here in Scripture. And it says he did this in the name of Israel, who was over them. Haggai and Zechariah knew that God was with them in this process. What an encouraging message that is, to know that if you are in relationship with God and you are dealing with challenges, maybe as a supervisor, as a leading a group of people, that you can be motivated by going to the Lord during those difficult times. We can go to God in prayer for our current daily issues that we have. And here God was using, in a much larger stage, Haggai and Zechariah to motivate the people. It also says there that in the end of verse 2, that they began to rebuild the house of God that is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. We need support as individuals. If you're leading others, you need to support them as well. And certainly this story, as we get into Ezra and then Nehemiah, we continue to see leaders, right? Leaders that are encouraging, and every one of us can be a leader in our own way. And I think that's what's really neat about this particular passage, is that they're kickstarting a project that has been basically been on hold for 15, 16, 17 years since Cyrus approved them, gave the decree. We'll talk about that in a minute. Gave the decree for them to be able to do what they needed to do. And so the story then goes on there in verses 3 through 5, where it talks about the governor of the province beyond the river. Now, I think if you noticed on Sunday, one of the things that I pointed out is Darius was very instrumental in organizing the land that the Persians actually controlled. And so in order to do that, he actually laid out provinces throughout the lands. And with each of those provinces, he would appoint a governor. And in this case, the governor is an individual named Tattenai. And Tattenai, having responsibility along with Shethar-Benzani, and I believe that's actually would be a higher up individual based on what I read, if I read that correctly. They came collectively, noticing that as I said in the very beginning, if you've seen a project kind of stalled for that many years, they're like, what is going on? Why are these people doing this? So as a governor of that region, he was responsible for reporting back to Darius. So that's where he's going to them. And notice he says, who gave you a decree to build this house and finish the structure? And I think that's very telling, because as kings do, if they give a decree, that's what's going to happen. And so the governor's thinking, okay, someone of significance has given them approval to restart, and they've started this project again. And they said, what names of the men who are building these buildings? And says in verse 5, but the eye of God was on the elders of the Jews, And they did not stop until the report should reach Darius, and then an answer be returned by letter concerning it. The key here is that the eye of God was on them. That's why they kept going. That's why they kept moving along. God being involved in all this process is the message that I want you to get this evening. And that starting again required encouragement by individuals there. In this case, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. But once they got encouraged, Zerubbabel started again. And that's what I think is a good lesson for us. Thoughts on these first 5 verses. When you think about encouraging others and how you get people, if you will, kick-started again.
Fascinating to me. They asked, what are the names of the men who are building this building? I'm taking names.
He's taking names, and that's significant because if you think about it too, I'm glad you brought that up, because if you think about it too from the perspective that who are the names, who in whose name is this all being done for? It's being done in the name of God, the true and living God, the God of Israel and Judah. That's whose name it's being done under. And I think that's exactly, if God is with you, who can be against you? He's absolutely right. And I think that is a key piece here. And that's why I wanted to underscore these aspects of the name of God of Israel, that the eye of God was watching over them. This was being done in the name of God. And so, again, the application I think we can pick up from this is that as we work with others, as our family here at Brentwood, as we work together and we learn together, that's opportunities for us to encourage one another. Maybe someone's going to be in this congregation that hasn't really cracked their Bible in 10 years as much as they should. And we need to be helping and motivating, encouraging those people. And I think that's a really good lesson that Haggai and Zechariah gives us here in these first 5 verses. Anyone else? Observations, as Brother Gale might say, not necessarily questions. Okay. All right. Excellent. So let's look at the next section here, and this is actually regarding the letter that Tattenai writes to King Darius. And it says this is a copy of the letter that Tattenai, the governor of province beyond the river, and that's what Tattenai actually means, beyond the river. So I don't know how that all ties together, but that is the meaning of that word, his name. And Shethar and Benzani and his associates and the governors who were in the province beyond the river sent to Darius the king. In verse 7 it says, they sent him a report in which was written as follows: to Darius the king, all peace. Be it known to the king that we were in the province of Judah to the house of the great God. It is being built with the huge stones and timbers is laid in the walls. This work goes on diligently and prospers in their hands. Verse 9, then we asked those elders and spoke to them thus, who gave you a decree to build this house and to finish this structure? We also asked their names for your information, that we might write down the names of their leaders. And this was their reply to us. We are the servants of God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the house that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and finished. But because our fathers had angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried away the people to Babylonia. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, Cyrus, the king, made a decree that this house of God should be rebuilt. And we'll talk about the details of that following in just a moment. So they've written this letter. We've read a portion of the letter. And what's very interesting about this is that what responsibility does Tattenai have in even making the king aware of this? What would be the potential danger of a governor of a province not notifying the king of some activity that is going on and hasn't been going on, and then all of a sudden it started up. I would think Tetaniah's position would be getting pretty wobbly, and yes, you would probably have soldiers invading that area to get things under control. The other thing that I think is, I've read just in other kind of commentaries, Darius was dealing with a lot of wars, a lot of upheaval, not necessarily against a particular nation, but different provinces were known to kind of rise up and challenge, and the governors of those particular provinces. So it doesn't really shock me, even beyond just the basics of knowing that kings tended to be off with your heads is their typical response. But I think Darius in particular was really dealing with a lot of challenges on multiple fronts. And so when you've got Tetaniah here coming to the king in the form of a letter and making him aware of this, it's not really surprising at all. And I think too, as you look at it, a couple of things jump out at me in verse 8 when he talks about going to the province of Judah. It says the house of the great God. Now, they thought and believed there were many gods. It's interesting they call this one the great God, and we'll notice something that I picked up on later about Darius and the God that he actually worshiped in just a moment. But it says in verse 8 again, it is being built, that is the house of the great God, it is being built with huge stones, and timber is laid in the walls. If you look over in 1 Kings chapter 6, if you look over there, this is actually talking about Solomon and the building of the temple. And if you have time, just to refresh your memory, you can go back and read that later on your own. But it talks about all the details that went into that. But if you look in chapter 6, verse 36, specifically, it says, he built the inner court with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. So just by virtue of the fact that Tetaniah, who is clearly not a former exile or a Jew or anything of that nature, he's noticing the huge stones in the timber and how it's being laid. What was the pattern the people were following here, is my question. What were the men who were rebuilding this following the pattern of? The original temple, right? They're going back to the way God had commanded the temple to be built. They weren't just putting up their own version. Sometimes we see a lot of people that they'll do their own. We certainly see this in movies. That's not a really good analogy, but you see this when it comes to people trying to do their own version of a particular design or building. That's not what the people of Zerubbabel were doing here. That's not what the Israelites wanted to see. They wanted to see something that was in the thought and vein of the original temple that God had commanded to be built when Solomon originally built it. And I just point out the fact that the work, how it was being done, we talked about encouragement in those first 5 verses. Tetaniah says, the work's going on diligently and it prospers in their hands. If you've ever had to pick up something that's been halted for a number of years, what are some of the challenges of restarting the project? If you had to take a house that had been abandoned, that had been partially constructed, I see a construction man in the audience. If something's been deserted, Wes, for 15, 20 years and everything's gone, what do you have to do to prepare for that, to restart that?
We just worked on one like that. It was a big house.
Okay.
And all the plumbing was in the concrete. We didn't know where it went, where the wires were, where supports were. We had to almost start over at the city, and just get all kinds of re-inspections, things like that. Look up records.
That's and so if you think about where they are now, granted, Zerubbabel was a part of the original, so he might have had a little bit more knowledge of what the the supplies that were there. But I dare say some of the supplies probably were stolen in large part if they've been there that many years. So you're having to kind of restart and kind of reassess and get everything back together before you can build again. And yet it says here in this passage that the work was diligent and they were prospering. It's nothing like having a group of people that are all moving the same direction of how much you can get done. Mr. Darrell, I know, has talked many a times about organizations and everybody getting on the same page and how much that organization can move forward in just a short period of time. They were moving because Tattenai noticed, and he was making sure the king was aware of this. And I point to the fact that he told the king, they asked him, who gave this decree? Again, I think they were saying, did you tell them to do this? Because we don't know where they got the official authority to move forward. And as Mr. Jack was talking about taking names, and their response being, we are who? The servants of God in heaven of earth, of heaven and earth. And we are rebuilding the house that was built many years ago by a great king of Israel, built and finished, which is King Solomon. So I'll pause there for a moment. Comments or thoughts on what you see there? Exactly, and that's exactly what they're requesting of Darius to do. I think we read stories in the Bible about where they went and massacred a whole country that they were invading. And I think in our minds we think, we don't necessarily think modern day military, we think of just savages. But the reality is, to your point, there was order with the Persian kingdom, and they had hierarchy. And I think that was probably one of Darius' strengths in being able to maintain and control things, albeit there were, various skirmishes that were going on. But yes, there was order here, and I think they were absolutely looking for Darius to say who authorized this. So definitely a pattern of organization. Yeah, Dan?
It's interesting to read about these in verse, starting in verse 11, when they're talking about gold and silver ornaments.
Mm-hmm.
You can look in, of course, Jeremiah, when Nebuchadnezzar sacked the temple, Jeremiah 52, to see what those were. But then you can also look in Daniel chapter 5, when Belshazzar was feasting. And Belshazzar was Nebuchadnezzar's son. And when they
Yes, they are, and it was a part of the worship of one of the great kingdoms that had existed. I mean, the kingdom of Solomon was one that, was so mighty. I don't even think we can even conceptualize. But given the history, when time passes on, people forget, and so this is one where clearly, this has moved on in a time where they didn't know Solomon. They only had heard about him. And this is why it's so impressive that they're going back to that same pattern. And yes, those articles are clearly important. And hearing about them over multiple years, right? Hundreds of years, same articles that are being referenced. Yeah, that was good. Thank you, Dan. Anyone else? One thing I wanted to point out is that in this letter that Tattenai writes to King Darius, they say in verse 11, and this was their reply to us, we are the servants of God of heaven and earth. It's very interesting. I read that Darius worshiped a god named Ahura Mazda, not to be confused with Kia or Chevy or Ford. Ahura Mazda was the name of this god. And he was known, this God was known as the God of heaven. This is all, as the teacher, you get to give your thoughts. So I think this was very purposeful, that this was their reply to Tattenai, that they said, we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth. Meaning, when Tattenai hears this, you can call your God whoever you want. We have the God of heaven and earth, the God. I think that's significant, and I think we miss things like that sometimes when we start reading these Old Testament passages. I think they were underscoring to Darius, who was the ultimate decision maker in this case, they're underscoring to him that this is whose name we're doing it in. They can ask about a decree, they can ask about, why we're doing it, who's motivating us, but we're doing this all in the name of God. So I wanted to share that thought with you. Anyone else before we complete the rest of the letter here? All right, so I'm going to go back a little bit. Verse 13. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, Cyrus the king made a decree that this house of God should be rebuilt. Again, this is what the rest of the letter said. And the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple that was in Jerusalem and brought into the temple of Babylon, these Cyrus the king took out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered to one whose name was Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. And he said to him, take these vessels, go and put them in the temple that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its site. A few things to point out here. This is the information that was fed to Tattenai, and he is now talking about this in the letter. For those who are sitting in class for the first time, can someone share with us who is Nebuchadnezzar, just to make sure we're all on the same page, in case you're just stepping in. Who is Nebuchadnezzar? King of Babylon. That's correct. So he's the king of Babylon. The kingdom of Babylon was the first, if you will, kingdom, if you will, that destroyed the rest of what was left of the divided kingdom. Yes.
It didn't just say that Nebuchadnezzar came and took it. It said God gave it.
Good point. Excellent. And what do you think God gave it to him? What does that tell us? What do we learn from that? Yes, and that brings on a whole nother set of thoughts for us to use as application. We often we do live a very selfish perspective often on a daily basis, and that's somewhat human nature, that we think about ourselves. If something comes against us, or we have some bad incident as a result of an individual, we kind of think of it in a vacuum, and we don't think about maybe at the time, and it might not be a person, it could be an event. What is that telling us? What is it teaching us? How do we benefit from this negative situation that's occurred? Now, in this case, Nebuchadnezzar, he was used by God. We know Nebuchadnezzar was not a godly man, at least certainly not initially. Seems like he had some connection to God a little bit later on in his life, but ultimately this was a person that was a king that was thinking of conquering nations and ruling all, and that's who God used to control the situation as it related to the children of Israel and their sin and going away from him. And I think we forget that God can use a variety of negative situations or even people that might even be ultimately evil.
After he used it, he punished him. After God had used him, he said, he's my servant. And after his duty was accomplished for God, then God brought the hammer down on him.
He did. And so just as God, moved his children of Israel in this situation, he said, I'm using the kingdom of Babylon, and we'll use them until we're going to bring the Persians along and they defeat them all. And Babylon is no more. Babylon is just there on the side, and Persia is now in place. So I bring all that up to kind of emphasize the fact that there was a decree made by then the conquering king, Cyrus, and so much so that he even sent an appointed governor to have them take the vessels and put them back in the house of God to be rebuilt. So that is what's been told in this letter. And later on Sunday we'll talk about chapter 6 where Darius researches this. But then in verse 16 it says, Then this Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of God that is in Jerusalem, and from that time until now it has been in building, and it is not yet finished. Verse 17, Therefore, if it seems good to the king, and this is what Darrell was talking about, let search be made in the royal archives there in Babylon to see whether a decree was issued by Cyrus the king for the rebuilding of this house of God in Jerusalem, and let the king send us his pleasure in this manner. Quite the ending of a letter. Quite the ending. So the information has been shared with the king. Again, I don't want to jump ahead because I have some other things I want to discuss this evening. But any other thoughts around the last portion of chapter 5 that come to mind? Okay, we got about 5 more minutes. I have a number of questions that I always like to write just to spur thought, and so I'll kind of share these with you, and would love to get some feedback. I've given you my thoughts on the challenges. What do you think the challenges that a Jewish community faced in rebuilding the temple, as mentioned in Ezra 5? What were some of the basics that come to your mind? I've talked about once you start a project and stop it, it's hard to get it restarted again, just the people themselves. What are some other things that they may have faced beyond just the motivation to move forward? Okay. The discouragement. Okay.
They've come on a strong
I also think about it too. You know, if you have an opportunity to have a cleanup day at the church, we try to do it on a Saturday when we know people are not working, you know, and doing their other jobs. I mean, I think about it in the context of if you're stopping everything to work on this very elaborate temple, how do you financially work through just your immediate household and dealing with that?
Hey guys, because that's one of the problems. They're working on the temple, but they still building their own, he called them animal houses, so they were building themselves and building pretty nice houses, but they were doing these work on the Lord's house.
Right, right. So, but there's that, at least that environment of where, you know, Don, if you've already seen some nice houses being built, it's human nature to say, well, I need to get my house built too, and you know, there's a conflict, right? I mean, you know, there's only so many out there. Everybody has the same amount of hours in the day, in the week, the year, the month, the year. Everybody's got the same, and I saw that's that's a challenge also that I thought of as well. Other challenges that they might have been trying to overcome. What did we talk about the people that were causing the problems? What did they originally want to do that we talked about on Sunday in chapter 4? They wanted to do the people that were of, I'll just use the general Gentile word, Gentile or Samaritan, which we talked about are, you know, we're basically a mixed race, blood race of people. What did they originally want to do when they first came there? They wanted to be a part of it, right? They wanted to be a part of that, and obviously now they were shunned from that for, I think, a variety of reasons. So how do you think one of the challenges might be as it relates to those people being around? It's hard to do a job. Wes, have you ever tried to build a house or add on to a room and maybe the person that owns the house is maybe giving commentary as you do all of your work? Probably not the job you're going to pick up the second time around or third time around, would be my guess. And that's just giving commentary. These people were, you know, prohibiting them from building. We're constantly that obstacle. Can't imagine, you know, with all that going on, alongside the other challenges of just getting this organized. Yes, sir.
After 17 years, we're going to take a good inventory and see if all these big cut stones and timbers are still available that were provided and paid for and so forth and so on to go forward with the job.
Yeah, they called them mighty stones, which, again, I don't think that's an accident either. I think these were specific types of stones that had been selected as part of the construction.
I think we also, Eric, we see like the power of having the knowledge of the Lord is with you and what that can do. When you look at what Haggai was saying to me, and you look at the last part of the first chapter of Haggai, in verse 13 it says, Haggai the messenger of the Lord spoke to the people with the Lord's message. I am with you, declares the Lord. He stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, he stirred up the spirit of Joshua, he stirred up the spirit of all the remnant of the people, and they came together to work in the house of the Lord. And I think for me, that's, or, you know, even us, that's the message when you think, even particularly of Christ, his last comments, like, lo, I am with you always. So that we can remember, no matter what our circumstances or situations that we may face ourselves or be in, that the strength and knowledge of knowing that the Lord is with you can allow you to conquer things.
Yeah, I think we have lost the power in that, the Lord being with us and what that means. I think we take for granted, we talk about God in a church setting like this. We might read our Bibles and hear about the Lord God of heaven and earth. This is the creator of all things from before time was a thing. Time is not a part of God. God is everything. that's the one that's with you. And that's something that we should be inspired by. We should be inspired as individuals. We should be inspired collectively as Christians. And we should be inspired to share that with others. We live in a world that's full of people putting obstacles in the way, saying you can't do it, and there's no hope. There's plenty of that to go around with all types of false gods of the modern day around. But we have the true and living God that Scripture still allows us to read about. And that's what we should be really motivated by and inspired by. Thank you, Roger. That was good. Appreciate that. Anyone else?
I sat on the couch last night and talked with my wife a little bit about our life. And we're becoming senior citizens these days. And I said to Debbie, I said, we're fortunate to have lived the life that we have and have our family and what we need to go about continuing our life here. And she looked at me and just smiled and she said, we're blessed. Well, when God's involved and you're doing it His way, it's a blessing that sometimes we lose sight of, that we're on His team.
Yeah. And I think you can be blessed and things not be going well at all. I think that's where people kind of misconstrue that term blessing. Yes.
That's part of what Haggai's message is that they are blessed, but they're not blessed as much as they would be. That they are not getting the return on their labor that they would if they do what God told them to do.
Yeah.
He says, you work, but you don't get full. This is not the way it's supposed to be.
Right.
So, he tells them to do that,
Yeah.
and they will be fully blessed.
And it's working in God's name and not as individuals. Absolutely. Absolutely. So,
Which I don't know if there's any growth, but it's interesting how I didn't think this comment as we look at how he wrote the letter in response. The question was like, who gave you this decree? And the answer that he wrote was immediately like, well, the decree didn't come from Cyrus. But the first part of the answer was, we are servants of God. And that's where, in fact, our authority is coming.
that's the authority. Exactly.
From where it was destroyed came from. Now, however, yeah, Cyrus did give us this decree, you can look it up, but we've been refreshed in our minds about actually why and who it is we're doing what we're doing.
And I think that's exactly why, the response was what it was. And that's why this chapter begins with Haggai and Zechariah, who were put there by God, supporting them. That's exactly why the response is what they gave, because they're doing this. This decree came from the Lord of Lords, all gods. And that's the powerful message there. So I think the final bell's about to ring, but we will be picking up in chapter 6 in the book of Ezra on Sunday. So if you're here, please join us. Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, one final comment. We've been talking about the book of Haggai and all the things that he said. And one of the interesting things that I have only just thought of as we've been studying this is, where is the temple located now? It's us.
Mm.
We're the temple. And how
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent comment. I think there's opportunities in this, in many books in the Old Testament, but in this one to do some self-reflection of what we're supposed to be. Dan, I think that's a great thought around the temple, and we are that temple now. So again, we'll be picking up in chapter 6 on Sunday. Thank you so much for everyone's participation this evening.